Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I guess we are set to go. Welcome everybody out there. Welcome Rutger. My name is Vincent. I'm part of Rethinking Economics in Rotterdam. And on behalf of Rethinking in Rotterdam and Rethinking Economics Netherlands, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar called Replacing GDP by 2030, which is actually the book title of a publication of Rutger Hoekstra, who I would like to welcome and give some brief explanation about what's going to wait for you today. So actually our agenda looks like we are doing 3 different parts in terms of we are starting off with a presentation by Rutger himself about his research and the topic GDP and the well-being and sustainability community. Afterwards, we are going to have some Q&A session. So this one works like if you look down at the screen, you have some Q&A button. If you click on that one, you can submit your questions, and you can also decide on which questions are being asked later on by upvoting those which are appealing to you. Our very last stage is some experiment in terms of we are going to do some quiz with you, thereby using the platform Kahoot. And the winner of this quiz will receive a copy of Rutger Hoekstra's Replacing GDP by 2030. About today's guest, Rutger Hoekstra. So he has done his PhD in environmental economics about 20 years ago at the VU in Amsterdam, and has been working with many different international institutions afterwards. Among them, the United Nations, the World Bank, the European Central Bank, and many others. And he spent much time working for the Institute for Statistics in Netherlands, Statistics Netherlands, CBS, and collaborated with many partners. And in addition, also taught at the university in Leiden. He's the founder of metricsforthefuture.com, an advisory platform in the well-being and community, in the well-being and sustainability field. And I'm pleased to have him with us. So the word goes straight to you, Rutger. Welcome here.
Yep, thanks, Vincent. Let me put my slides up. Thanks a lot, Vincent, and hello to everybody in the chat. It's always a bit difficult to do a speech like this if you don't have kind of a view of your audience. But I have been following the work of Rethinking Economics for quite a while, and I think it's I'm very privileged actually to be speaking to you, because I do think my book is very much in line with, with the thinking of a platform like Rethinking Economics. And I think actually my own history as well kind of matches to a certain extent a journey which I think Rethinking Economics also has. I actually grew up as a teenager in Kenya, and I was always very interested in environmental problems. I was a bit of a worrying child, I would say, where acid rain and poaching of elephants that really bothered me to a very large extent. So when I went to study in Wageningen, I did study environmental economics, but I did find that it was useful, of course, to look at it with mainstream economic tools. But I did feel, things like utility maximization, profit maximization, they didn't really resonate with me. And so when I went to the VU, I actually did a PhD in ecological economics, which is a more of a heterodox version, actually, of environmental economics. And then I spent around 15 years at Statistics Netherlands, and there I would say I became kind of an empirical researcher in well-being and sustainability. So I really stretched the boundaries of what I was interested in, also to social issues. And now I would say I'm kind of an empirical interdisciplinary scientist. I've become slightly more critical of the term economics and of economists, because I think it turns up far too often when sometimes what we mean is that we want to solve problems, global problems, and economics has part of the solution, but by far not all of it. So, you know, the quest for pluriformity in economics, which Rethinking Economics has, and also I think this focus on interdisciplinary research, I think that's very much also in line with my own journey. Now, for the book, or for this speech, I'm going to actually follow the synopsis of the book quite closely. And basically, to set up the problem, I think we really need to understand three questions, or understand the answer to these. Why is GDP so successful? You know, why is it all around? What does GDP measure, and what does it not? I think that's a very crucial question, which has been debated for decades. And also, if there have been alternatives to GDP suggested for at least 50 years, why have none of these been successful? I think with these three crucial questions, you can come to a certain conclusion. And that is the second part of my book, where I kind of have a project plan of how you might go about replacing this powerful indicator in society. And just as an added dimension to today's speech, I would like to open also the discussion about the COVID-19 pandemic. Otherwise, I think somebody will ask anyway in the Q&A. But I also think it's interesting to think about, you know, what kind of society will we actually have after this? What evidence might there be on well-being, sustainability, and inequality? But this is more of a brainstorm, actually. There are some thoughts by myself, but of course, I think this is a rather open question at the moment. And so I think that's also a nice time to go to the questions. So the first question of the problem setting is, why is GDP so successful? Well, this is a graph showing basically the previous century and the number of countries measuring GDP. And nowadays, we are very much used to this idea that 200 countries measure GDP, and in many cases, they actually do that 4 times a year. So actually 4 times a year in 200 countries, people are churning out these numbers. But if you go back 1 century, you'll actually find that only 9 countries back in 1900 had actually ever measured their national income. So it's not as if this was always the case. It is actually an innovation which has spread across the globe to these 200 countries. And I think there's 2 ways to look at this graph. So the one is the kind of the negative way of saying, well, these bloody economists, you know, what an awful thing that they've colonized the whole world with their statistic. But you could also see it from the admiration point of view, that you say, well, wow, what an achievement, you know, from an innovation that was basically only done in 9 countries very irregularly. They've set up this statistic to be a global statistic. And I kind of prefer the second perspective, because that also tells you how you might learn from that experience. So to learn from how did economists do this, how did they actually manage to get this statistic spread across the entire world, I think it's really good to look at the history. Now in the book I have quite a long section on this, but you know, the basics is that in times of crisis, the Great Depression and the Second World War, economists did a really great job of advising governments on how to go through these situations. So the Great Depression was of course a huge social challenge, and economists identified how to get through it, and perhaps also stop them from happening. And economists also played a really important role in the war effort for the Second World War, especially in the United States and the UK. And so building on that success during the crises, I would say they actually went into the golden age. So economists basically became the advisors to government in the post-war period. And remember that in the post-war period, the government was also very big. So not only were they very important in government, but government was also very large. Now, from the 70s, and so social and environmental issues definitely became very prominent, and criticism really started. And in the book, I also suggest that perhaps starting from the financial crisis in 2008, you might see that there are some indications of demise. But I want to focus your attention on this golden age. What exactly did they build, did economists build that was so powerful that it even endures to this very day? And that is something which I call in the book the GDP multinational. So I've put flags up of all the countries that I've lived, and for the Dutch people, they'll recognize the Dutch flag. And in every country, you will find that there's a statistical office producing GDP figures. There'll be policy institutes like the Centraal Planbureau here in the Netherlands. There will be media outlets that report on Statistics Netherlands work or report on the CPB work or academics. It obviously goes to politics, and all of this is disseminated to society. So this is actually a fantastic logistical operation, which you will find actually is present in all 200 countries. So this is, you know, from a logistical and practical point of view, this is huge. And even to add to that, all international institutes collect the databases for GDP, so this is what I call the GDP multinational. I think it's very comparable to McDonald's having, you know, locations in all countries of the world and selling their Big Mac across in a logistical way. I think it works very much like a multinational. But there is one thing that is holding this together, the big secret, I would say, and that is the system of national accounts. This is the framework, which doesn't just show you how to measure a GDP. It actually shows you how to measure all the various flows flows and stocks in an economy. So it's actually a very comprehensive accounting framework. And what I think is so important about this is that it's kind of the gel that holds the GDP multinational together. It's like the recipe for the Big Mac, so to speak. And it acts like a common language so that macroeconomists all across the world can use a word like consumption or productivity or GDP. And it will actually, the people that are doing macroeconomics will actually know what that is and understand and agree on it. And it even shows you a little bit of the grammar by showing you what the relationships are between the various variables. And of course, because it's not just a number, it's also an entire accounting framework. It is actually the foundation of all macroeconomic modeling, or at least a large chunk of it. So to me, actually, the system of national accounts is perhaps the real success story, and not necessarily GDP. Now, this is a very technocratic way of viewing the GDP and the system of national accounts, but it actually has a very real impact on societal discourse. And to show you, I want to show you this graph. This is from Google Ngram figure, which is a Google database which has recorded all the books for 200 years. And you can actually see how prevalent certain words are in these books. And as you see, actually the word economic growth actually was hardly present before the war. And then it skyrocketed after 1950, and it has become the prevalent word that we all recognize to some extent today. And what I've added actually 3 other graphs as well. And the first is actually from a real multinational, the Xerox. So for I guess the slightly older people in the audience, they'll know that the Xerox was a photocopying machine, and that actually the word Xerox became synonymous with photocopying. So it's actually an example of where a multinational actually directly influences our language, just like we would say to Google something, which is also a verb. And so I want to create this parallel to show you that, you know, words and narratives in society do actually change as a result of these kind of organizations or multinationals. And even things like climate change and sustainable development, you know, it might be easy to think that perhaps Greta Thunberg is the catalyst of these kind of things. But actually, if you go back to climate change, for example, this is very much a term which was created or which was popularized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which started at the end of the 80s. And sustainable development is actually perhaps an even better example, where that word or that combination of words did not exist before the Brundtland report made it up in 1987. So actually that is very much a narrative which was promoted by the United Nations. And these narratives matter. They give words to our stories, to our policies, and also to our societies. So the second question, I think, which is obviously very important, is what does GDP measure and what not? Well, the system of national accounts is actually very clear on this. It measures economic activity, nothing more, nothing less. But actually, you will find quite a few economists that are critical of the way that it's done. And that has to do with that it's very hard actually to measure the economy. If you want to understand economic growth, you have to make a distinction between the price, the quantity, and the quality. And if you think of an iPhone, for example, you know, the price might change, the quantity might change, but over time also the quality of the iPhone also changes. And for each of these, you have to find a numerical value. So even the quality, which is probably the most problematic one, you know, what is the difference in percentage terms between an iPhone 7 and an iPhone 8, for example? So it is not as trivial as is sometimes thought to actually measure growth. Second aspect is that digitization has actually created quite a lot of free goods and services. So in the past, my parents would buy an encyclopedia, or they got one for their wedding actually. But nowadays we would simply go to Wikipedia, and there's no actually financial transaction. And you might actually say that this has actually led to a lower economic growth figures because the encyclopedia is no longer a commodity. And finally, a final problem is globalization. You know, in the past, economic activity, so the costs and the income and the profits would be all recorded in one country, but now multinationals can actually provide, you know, split their profits to other countries, and because of that, the GDP actually becomes a less suitable measure of economic activity. So these are actually all criticisms that, you know, economists would actually raise against these against GDP. But I think what, you know, for example, for this audience is obvious is that what's probably more important is that it doesn't measure the really important aspects of our society, such as well-being, sustainability, and equity. So just to briefly go through those, this is something called the Easterlin paradox, whereby these are all the dots are countries with their happiness score and their GDP per capita figures. And what you actually find is that GDP does matter for happiness scores for poor countries. So if poor countries get slightly richer, that definitely has an important influence on well-being. But at some stage, the the impact of having more income doesn't have a great influence or any influence at all on happiness scores. So this is called the Easterlin paradox. The second aspect of sustainability is, of course, quite clear, that together with all this economic process, there has been a huge increase in our pressures on our natural system. Just here, you'll see that in 1950, the annual CO2 emissions were around 5 billion tons, and that actually has increased sevenfold in the 70 years that we're talking about now. And the last point, of course, is the equity aspect. Piketty, this is a graph from Piketty showing the development of income inequality in the United States, and showing that actually income inequality was in fact reducing for quite a while. But then after the 1980s, income inequality has definitely started to increase really rapidly. And this is true for quite a few OECD countries. So in all these cases, GDP is not measuring these important aspects. And I think that's the real problem with GDP. It's not so much that it's, it's a measure of economic activity. But what it is often seen as is that it is some kind of measure of success of a country. And if we would actually look at the real measures of success of society, then GDP is not a measure of success. And what is a bit problematic, which I found quite a difficult issue in my book, is that this is actually has been known for decades. So this second question, what does GDP measure and what not, that has been discussed for 50 years in the scientific literature, and yet at this moment in time, it is still so dominant. So that was the real question, which I thought was interesting, that if it's scientifically already disproven, how can it remain so powerful? Well, let me return to the metaphor of the innovation. And actually, two Nobel Prize winners, Paul Samuelson and Bill Nordhaus, they actually said was probably GDP and SNA, the system of national accounts, are probably among the greatest inventions of the 20th century. For economists, this is really a foundational contribution, I think, to economics. But what is, I think interesting is that from innovation theory, we know that innovations, come and go. So I've put up some music technologies up there, and we know that the cassette recorder was replaced by the CD, and CD was replaced by digital music. And this is a process that we call creative destruction. Schumpeter called it that. But why has this not happened? If GDP clearly has flaws in terms of successful measurement, then why have we not replaced it through creative destruction? And it's not because there haven't been any suggestions. For the last 50 years or so, economists and others have been suggesting alternatives. This is one which is very prominent in economic literature. It's called the genuine progress indicator. And basically what you do is you start with GDP or another macroeconomic figure, and then you add and subtract things which are not measured by GDP. So for example, GDP doesn't measure leisure. So what you do is that you actually measure the leisure time, you provide a euro value, a monetary value to that, and you add that to GDP. But of course, GDP also has negative effects which are not recorded, such as environmental damages or perhaps increases in inequality. So there again, what you need to do is you need to find a monetary value of those damages and inequality, and then you would actually subtract those. And what you actually get when you do that is you get the genuine progress indicator. And Costanza and colleagues have published in Nature on this indicator. And this is the graph which they show. And it shows that actually from 1950 to the early 2000s, GDP continued to grow basically at the same speed and showed quite a positive development. But if you actually correct for all the positive and negative aspects of growth, then suddenly you see that the genuine progress indicator actually shows that we've basically been stagnant since the 1970s. And I think this is a very important message, which actually is very little known in society. Now, this is one of the alternatives that have been suggested to GDP, and it's existed since 1972 in various forms. Another approach is indicator sets. So, for example, in the Netherlands, we have a very important publication by the Statistics Netherlands called the Monitor Brede Welvaart, which has a large set of indicators. And the reasoning is that you can't really summarize developments in well-being and sustainability into one indicator. You need various indicators to do the various dimensions, such as CO2 emissions, education, time use. All the different aspects of life and sustainability need to be measured in their own units. And perhaps an even more well-known initiatives are the Sustainable Development Goals, which also have a set of indicator and targets to measure our progress towards sustainable development. But these are just three examples. So the General Progress Indicator, the Monitor Brede Welvaart, and SDGs are just three examples of actually hundreds of systems. And that's why I call it the Beyond-GDP cottage industry, because all over the world there are universities, institutes, individuals, NGOs. Everybody is creating these Beyond-GDP indicators or indexes. And the problem is, of course, that they are using very different terminology. So you'll see here just 40 examples of indexes. But they use all different types of terminology and methodologies. And the cottage industry can have either a positive connotation, where you say, well, it's energetic, there's a lot of energy, there's innovation and those kind of things. But at the same time, of course, we need to ask ourselves the question, what message are we sending as a total community compared to the GDP multinational? And that, I think, in a nutshell, is the real problem that we're facing, is that we have a really well-organized GDP multinational with a science and accounting framework and a key indicator. And on the other hand, we have this Beyond-GDP cottage industry, which is far too heterogeneous to really be involved, to really provide a powerful narrative to society. And I sometimes say, if you have a Martian come down to Earth, and he would have to guess which of these two communities was more powerful in terms of societal narratives, I don't think it is that difficult to identify the GDP multinational as being better organized at getting their message across. But what I think the GDP history tells us, that it wasn't always like this. GDP actually in the 1930s was also a cottage industry. All countries had different ways of measuring national income. So it's not an inevitability that we need to have a cottage industry and that will be the case forever. Actually, what happens is that you can organize this, and the United Nations did this through this system of national accounts. So that's the second part of my presentation, is about the solution. And I think from the history of GDP, we can again learn that actually their template, the template that economists followed, was actually a very powerful one. And so this GDP multinational is actually a community which was built around a scientific question, which is to understand and create policies for economic growth. There was a clear distinction between kind of an academic work on macroeconomics, so policy science, which is done in economic institutes or at academia. And then there's a statistical aspect where there's an entire accounting framework and key indicators that are derived from the accounting framework. And what I find, what I try to stress in the book is the importance of this common language which the system of national accounts provides, and of course also the importance of institutionalizing macroeconomic statistics and science. So basically, I think the United Nations could do a similar process that they did after the Second World War, and that is to create a community which is aimed at understanding and creating policies for well-being, sustainability, and equity. And from the community structure which the macroeconomists have, we also need to understand that there's a division of labor between science, accounting, and indicators. And again, the accounting system is crucial in terms of the language that we can speak together, because it is very much unacceptable that we have different ideas about well-being, about sustainable development, about all these different issues. We don't really have a standard. And I guess, or the deadline that I've set is for 2030. Of course, if we're capable of achieving that earlier, that would be fabulous. But I do think, to change the narrative of society, we also need to be realistic about how quickly that might be achieved. So I want to just, before I go into the pandemic issue, I just want to raise two issues which I think will be interesting for this audience. So for this UN process, should economists be in the lead of this process? And something which is often asked of me, which indicators can we expect to replace GDP? Now, my book doesn't end with, this is the golden index for that replaces GDP. I think that would be very strange if I propose a process to get towards such a system and then, have my own index added to the hundreds of others. But I can give you an indication of where I think the solution might lie. So let me get to the first issue first. Should economists be in the lead? Well, in the book, I do have quite a few chapters on the accounting framework. And this is basically the outline of the framework. There are 4 system accounts. And the first one is actually the environment. And I think that's very important, that we stop also seeing the economy as the central framework and then work our way out. I think actually our natural environment should be the first and foremost accounting system. After that, of course, there is the society, which is also broader than the economy, which shows us demography, time use, health, education. And then within that, there is the economy. So that's actually the third system in my accounting framework. And of course, the distribution issue is, of course, hugely important. Now, to be quite frank, there's nothing very radical about this way of setting it up. I think in sustainability science, this has been kind of the frame of thought for decades or so. So I've simply used, I think, what sustainability science has yielded for a long time. And I think the answer to the questions, should economists be in the lead, becomes fairly obvious when you also frame it like this. I think economists have wonderful answers to a lot of questions, but they do not have all the answers to all the questions. You wouldn't want an economist telling you how climate changes and what the relationships is between CO2 and temperature. You wouldn't want an economist to tell you how demography works and you know how that happens. So I think economics definitely has a role, of course, in this interdisciplinary science, but I'm actually looking more towards an interdisciplinary approach. And to get to that interdisciplinary approach, I think we also need to try and find common language aspects of these various domains. And I've identified 3 in the book. So the first is stock flow accounting. So if you go to the bottom left corner, you'll see that there are, you know, what happens in the system of national accounts, so that you have financial assets, then there is income and there's outflows, and then there's a new stock of financial assets in T+1. But actually, this is done also by demographers. They measure a population in a time T, then they look at births and deaths and migration, and then that leaves you with a population in T+1. And even environmental climate scientists, that's actually also what they do. They look at CO2 in the atmosphere, they look at the emissions, and they look at the uptake from vegetation and from the oceans, and that leaves you with a new stock of CO2 in the atmosphere. So actually, taken from that perspective, accounting is not something which is reserved only for economists. There's accounting actually everywhere in all types of sciences. A second layer of, I think, commonality between all these sciences is networks. So ecosystems are, of course, very complex feeding and symbiotic networks and systems. And biologists and ecologists will study it in that way. But also in society, I think the coronavirus has also showed us that it's made very visible what type of social contacts, what type of social networks we have. And in the economy, of course, economists have been studying global value chains and relationships and supply chains for a very long time, of course. So again, this is a commonality, I think, between many scientific domains. And the last one is the issue of limits. In the top right-hand corner, it will be a bit small for you to read, but this is the framework adopted by Hoekstra, which shows the planetary boundaries that we are transgressing. So our natural system simply does not have the ability to digest a lot of the things that are created by human actions. And this is a visualization of that, of the limits of our planet. But even in society, there are many limits which you can think of, and time is perhaps the most obvious one. And even in the economy, I think also the coronavirus has shown us quite a bit. For example, I did not realize up to the corona crisis that the oil, you know, the storage of oil, there was a limit to that. Now it seems very obvious to me, but the oil price actually reduced to lower than zero because there was simply no area to have the excess oil. And I've put up a picture here of the Tesla Gigafactory because they actually had a lot of trouble churning out the Teslas, not because of lack of demand, but simply because of a limit to their production capacity. Now, the crux question, which I want to explain, is what would replace GDP? What kind of indicators would tell us, you know, how well-being, sustainability, and equity are going? And this cartoon that is shown here actually is quite prominent in the thinking. Basically, GDP is one index, and there is quite a popular view that we need indicators to replace this one index. So we need to know all the dimensions of our society, but we need to measure them all in their own units. And to put it in the framework of the accounting system that I showed, basically that would mean that the sustainable development goals, for example, would be taken from the system accounts. So those would actually provide, you know, CO2 emissions, education, health type indicators. Now, the economists, as I showed you earlier, they have this approach called the genuine progress indicator, for example, whereby they say, well, you need a quality approach, evaluation method, which, for example, welfare economics can give you. And by doing that, you can get a monetary value to each of these developments, and then you can create this genuine progress indicator. And I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable with these two options, because on the one hand, I see the rationale of the, you know, the indicator sets, but at the same time, it seems a bit odd that if we have in science, we do have weighting schemes available, why would we not want to provide those to our policymakers? On the other hand, I do have experience with welfare economic measures and methods, and I know that there's quite a few problems also. So I'm also a bit uncomfortable saying the genuine progress indicator is the best alternative to GDP, because, you know, it is an imperfect method. And to explain what the, you know, what the book suggests, I have to go back to a series from the 1960s, I think, even, called Star Trek, of course. And in that series, I don't know whether there's any fans of that series, but there was a doctor and he had a machine called a tricorder. And all the doctor really had to do was point the tricorder to somebody who was having symptoms, and the tricorder would actually provide a diagnosis, you know, within a couple of seconds on the disease that somebody had. Now, even after centuries or even millennia of medical, you know, progress, we don't yet actually have a tricorder. This is science fiction. So in reality, what do we have? We have a doctor that can turn up to your house when you're ill, but he doesn't have a tricorder. All he has, or he or she has, are a couple of instruments, each of which are imperfect, which are measuring a certain aspect of your disease, but none of them are actually perfect. But what I find important is that the fact that they are imperfect is actually irrelevant, because taken together, these instruments together actually provide a pretty good basis for diagnosing the illness of the patient. So a set of imperfect instruments can actually lead to a fairly good diagnosis. And I think the parallel with the global system is hopefully now obvious, that which instruments do we have to assess well-being, sustainability, and equity? Well, the economists would say, well, we have welfare economics, and that leads to the genuine progress indicator. But I think there is enough evidence to say that that is not a tricorder. You know, welfare economics is useful, but it does not provide you with a definitive answer of all the diseases that are present in our world. And what I've actually done in the book is provided very many different approaches, actually, on how you might actually assess well-being, sustainability, and equity. And some are very mainstream economics, some are heterodox economics, and some are even from natural sciences. And I think that's what we need to be striving for, that we actually view the development of our globe, of our society, from a very heterodox or an interdisciplinary valuation perspective. And just to illustrate, in the top left-hand corner, you see one of the quality approaches is called hedonic psychology, and it leads to the U index. And that is actually something that Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, pioneered together with Alan Kruger. And I'd just like to show you what kind of different perspectives you get when you have a different quality approach than welfare economics, for example. So this is one of the results that they have. And basically what Kahneman and Kruger say is, well, if you want to measure well-being of a person, you should actually look at their activities during a day. And in the last column, you'll see the amount of time that people spend on certain activities. And in the first column, you'll see which activities they appreciate most and which they find the worst. And well, the worst thing to do is actually commuting. It is an American study, so perhaps it also has to do with the car, but commuting is definitely a fairly awful thing to do. Working doesn't score very highly. And something which is often quite surprising as well is taking care of my children, which apparently does not give very high marks in general terms. And of course, at the top, there are things like intimate relations, sex, socializing, relaxing, meditation, things that are generally not very well explained by goods and services, but perhaps better through social networks and those kind of things. And I think this framework is absolutely fascinating. I don't think it's perfect. Education is not very, studying is usually not very enjoyable. But once you do it basically as an investment, so it's not a perfect measure, but it does provide a totally different perspective on, I think, the well-being of people. And one of the things that is interesting, for example, is working. As I said, you spend a lot of time working. Generally speaking, on the positive, negative aspects, that is not valued very well. But if you go 3 columns to the right, it actually shows you what people's feeling of competence actually does. So that is actually, are you feeling as if you're doing something that you're good at, that you are competent at? And then suddenly work actually scores really, really high in the ranking. And so what I think this framework also tells us is that well-being is actually a very complex issue, and that we should also perhaps not be too simplistic about, what an improvement in well-being is. So now to the last section, which I think is more of a brainstorm with you, the audience. What impacts might COVID-19 pandemic have on, on our society? Some people are very hopeful. Some people are perhaps negative, thinking that we're going back to normal afterwards, and really arguing that we shouldn't. So I've just jotted down a couple of observations of mine. I don't think you can really, I would be weary of anybody at this moment who has some kind of crystal ball of where it's going to go. But from my perspective, these are a couple of the questions that I would have going forward. So the first is, of course, that we've seen that actually the drop in environmental pressure has been fairly limited. So I think CO2 emissions, for example, will drop by around 5 or 10% is the expectation. And that really shows you what a huge task we have to reduce CO2 emissions in any real way. And the question is, of course, how robust will this drop actually be afterwards? What I find very interesting is what impact will it have on investment, on the financial climate? a person like Warren Buffett divesting from airlines or the shares of oil companies, will that actually lead to a change in the investment climate? I think that's a very poignant question. If we turn to inequality, Piketty argued in his book actually that crises were really bad for the rich. So the Great Depression wiped out a lot of shareholder value. The Second World War, of course, did a lot of physical damage. And that's generally impacting the rich people the most. I do wonder, however, whether this will continue in this age, because in a certain sense, the government has also created safety nets for the rich. The Dow Jones did drop from 30,000 to 19,000, in the beginning of the pandemic, but it's back to around 24,000, I think, at the moment. So, from that perspective, 15% of the shareholder value has decreased, but I think previous crises has impacted the rich far worse. And I'm very curious to see what actually will happen to inequality figures. Then from the latter perspective, the well-being perspective, we also need to be quite realistic that GDP is sometimes important. 32,000 people have applied for jobless claims in the US in the last couple of weeks. So that signifies a huge drop in income for many people and the families and their dependents. Their income, I think, definitely does have an impact on their well-being. And, you can't get away with the saying, well, look at all this leisure time that you have, isn't that fabulous? So in some cases, income is, of course, very important. But I guess the overriding question is, what impacts in our lives and in our behavior will actually proceed in the future? And I think it's interesting to go back to the time use example that I had earlier, and just to see which activities would we actually be doing less of and more. And interestingly enough, of course, commuting and socializing definitely are things that we are doing less of, or are totally abstaining from at the moment. And this is, of course, also where the lower CO2 emissions and air pollution comes from, especially the commuting. And there are many other aspects, I think, which you could argue are going up or down. I think working is, of course, very different. For some people that are being laid off, they're not working at all. For people that are, there might be people that are working only 40 or 50% of the time, and perhaps are benefiting a little bit from this period. And there are, of course, people, for example, in healthcare that are working far more than they used to. So I think also these kind of frameworks are useful to kind of think through the, what might happen. But the big question is, of course, what aspects of these activities will actually change? Will we go back to our normal lives, or will we actually change some of our behavior, for example, in commuting or going to conferences or on holidays or any other of the activities that you see here? So my final slide before we go to the questions. My book argues that there should be an intergovernmental panel on well-being, sustainability, and equity, which brings together basically all of the knowledge that we have. It's not necessarily something very new, but it is an interdisciplinary approach to policy science, accounting, and indicators. I think it's fairly clear that it should be linked to the SDG process that we have, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the ultimate success factor of this community should be that we strive to change the narrative of society. The narrative should shift away from economic growth towards well-being, sustainability, and equity. And I think the post-COVID world does provide us with perhaps an argument line in which we could actually argue for such a process. So that is my presentation. And I'd love to hand over back to Vincent. I think there are already a couple of questions. So perhaps Vincent, could you moderate that? Thank you very much, by the way.
Exactly, so I'm taking over. Thank you as well, Rutger. I think this has been a very nice touch upon what you're explaining more detailedly in your book, Replacing GDP by 2030. And it's also a lot about thinking big in terms of how can we basically unite the well-being and sustainability community in this sense. And since you've ended with elaborating on the impact of COVID-19 and the impact of crises in general, I will just take the first question from the Q&A section from Vera. And she's actually stating that you've been making some quote on LinkedIn. So I'm just going to paraphrase it really quick. In terms of, you replied that some crises have brought about major changes and that there's a lot of wishful thinking regarding the current corona crisis. However, you believe there are reasons that this may be different in this case. What factors do you consider most relevant or essential in this situation that it will lead to a different result?
Yeah, this was a response to my LinkedIn profile. Interesting. So what I mentioned there was that I think, for example, we learned a great deal from the Great Depression. The role of government was very much something that came out of the Great Depression and also the Second World War. And for example, the Great Recession from 2008, I really think that we learned very little actually from the Great Recession. I think we taught banks that they needed more buffers so that they didn't collapse as quickly. But just from a systemic point of view, that was basically it. Not very much changed in terms of the kind of the neoliberal world architecture that we had at that time. So the question is, will this be a crisis that we learn from or not? Will it be a Great Depression or a Great Recession type learning curve? And I do think there are, there are indications, I would say, that having such a radical change in your pattern of life does show kind of systemic problems in our society. I think the United States, for example, they've been having debates about the healthcare system for a huge amount of time. But now through this crisis, it has become so evident, I think, that their healthcare system is not a viable option in a pandemic future. And so I think discussions there will definitely change. More generally, I think the role of government, I think, is now far clearer. The role of science, I think, has been enhanced. There was, of course, before the crisis, there has been this idea about alternative facts, and basically all science is an opinion. And I think government will definitely come out of this crisis with a higher standing. And I also think that science will come out with a higher standing. Now, daily lives, I find a little bit difficult. Will we go back to the way we were? I think some things might change, working from home might change a bit. I think going to conferences, I was feeling uneasy about that before as well. And I think that will continue. I think we will need a bit more there, I think, to get really radical changes. But I do think the financial sector is shifting, government is shifting. So a lot of narratives that I think were involved in kind of the aftermath of the financial recession are being toppled. And I think that is the most important part, is that narratives in society like the government is useless or science is just an opinion, once those kind of narratives are shown to be false, I do think that different narratives which are more science-based and problem-based, I think will actually emerge.
Okay, thank you. You've been talking about narratives and about large-scale changes. So I'm just going to connect that to the next question from Sebastian. In terms of if we want to replace GDP by other indicators, that also requires a change of mentality. So basically we cannot do this on a small scale, because if only one single country is implementing such kind of approach, it's not going to work. So we really need to be thinking bigger and have some globally oriented framework. So basically, how could that be done? And maybe also who should be in charge of that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's precisely the point that I try and make in the book, is that if economists have managed to organize themselves to produce GDP in 200 countries, 40 days after every quarter, we need to do exactly the same, or we need to do it better. If you want to compete against the Big Mac, then you need, as Sebastian says, you need an ambitious goal. And so that is what the book ends with. We need a quarterly well-being index. We need a quarterly sustainability statistics. We need quarterly inequality things. So my vision would be that the statistical offices of 200 countries would be producing economic statistics, and they would be producing these statistics as well. And journalists, I think, if that was the case, if there was agreement on all these type of things across the globe, I think journalists would find actually that the well-being, sustainability, and inequality angle is actually far richer than just saying, well, GDP increases or decreases. I think actually well-being figures quite often resonate much more actually with people than GDP figures. So I think if a journalist is driving towards Statistics Netherlands in 2030, and Statistics Netherlands offers him a press conference on economic growth and a press conference on well-being, sustainability, and equity, I think 90% of the journalists, if they are educated, if they have this background, would actually choose the well-being press conference. And I think that's the way, exactly like Sebastian says, I think we need to think of it in this big way, that we need to organize ourselves. It's not just sufficient, as I think you said, Vincent, to ever have all these indexes everywhere and just promote them individually. We need a global effort to really get this through.
Yeah, talking about this global effort, I'll just continue with the next question from Mark, which is about the institutions behind such kind of change. So you've been working with the OECD, for instance, with the European Commission, and also with Eurostat, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So should it be those institutions in charge, and do they also need to change? Do they have to become more political in some sense?
I actually think sometimes they're given slightly too little credit for the kind of things that they're doing. I mean, they definitely support GDP. So large portions of those organizations definitely support kind of the GDP narrative. But there are also very often large sections of those organizations which are working on Beyond-GDP projects. And so, for example, I think the OECD does a lot of great work in terms of well-being. And actually, they used to make, for example, economic forecasts, but now they never just do economic forecasts. They actually include well-being and sustainability issues immediately in any country assessment. But there is a danger, I think, the COVID crisis poses, and that actually was that in the 1960s, something similar happened to the situation that we have here. The OECD started a project on the problems of modern society, because they saw that all this economic growth did not stop social unrest, did not solve environmental issues. So they started a project at the end of the 60s even to kind of measure other things. But then the 1970s were economically very turbulent, and suddenly this program was scrapped, because all the member states, they said, listen, this is really a hobby project, get back to your core business of running the economy of the rich countries. And I think that is kind of the challenge that we have now as well. You do see a lot of politicians that a couple of months ago were saying that climate change was important, for example. Now backtracking, saying, well, climate change is important, but first let's do the economy, and then we can get back to talking about these hobby projects. And I think that's the real challenge, whether our communal strength to make sure that also the recovery has green and well-being aspects to it. I think that's the most important aspect of the development.
Okay, thank you. So linking that one to one specific example, Hidde is asking about the Monitor Brede Welvaart and the SDGs that you've been mentioning earlier on really quickly. I think the newest or the most recent version is about to be published in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion on those indicators and in terms of measuring welfare, and what can we actually derive from them? So how can we get some feasible interpretation in terms of, do we need some goals or benchmarks for these indicators?
Yeah. Well, I'm not objective in this sense, because I was involved in a project that preceded the Monitor Brede Welvaart, and I was also involved in the parliamentary commission that asked for the Monitor Brede Welvaart. So I'm not entirely objective in that sense. I think it's a really important publication, but perhaps not so much because of the interpretation. I think what's important about that publication is that it's getting policy traction and policy applications. Sometimes people tend to focus on the measurement aspect of all these systems. So also I think this question is more or less for, what do the measures mean? How can we get more information out of it? To be quite frank, as I said, there are hundreds of these systems, and each of them have their benefits and negative aspects. I think what's really important is that a measurement system by itself is of no use whatsoever if it's not used for a decision. And I think actually we are moving beyond metrics towards policy, beyond GDP policy. And the best example is New Zealand, where they have created an indicator set very similar to the Monitor Brede Welvaart. But what did they use it for? They used it for a budget. So now they are dividing the money from the Ministry of Finance, their treasury. They're dividing it according to well-being principles rather than economic principles. Now, I think that's the real step that we need to take. Measurements we need to improve. Sometimes that indicator set might need to be made smaller. Sometimes we might need an index. That is all great to have debates about that. But what's really, really important is that we create tools and policy options for politicians and governments, because that's what economists did. They didn't just provide GDP figures or the system of national accounts, but economists created models, they created cost-benefit analysis, they created scenarios, they created really, really useful tools so that politicians and governments can make decisions. And we need to stop thinking about measurements, but need to start thinking about tools which we can provide to governments to make decisions.
Okay, thank you. These tools that you've been mentioning, how can we actually get the data for that? So that's the question Elena is asking in terms of in the context of the SDGs. So there are multiple goals and different measurement methods. And we basically need a lot of data from all countries over the world.
Yeah.
They have to be aggregated, collected, and also evaluated in the end.
Yeah.
So how could we basically fill this gap of lacking data and also the disparities between different countries in terms of data availability and maybe also accuracy?
Yeah. Well, the UN, I think within these last 2 years has done a huge job of actually collecting loads of these SDG data. And a lot of money has been pouring into developing countries as well to create some of this capacity. But I again would like to point out to history. and say that when the system of national accounts was being created, GDP, there was also a revolution in survey statistics. So theoretically and methodologically, people were identifying how to do a survey, and a survey is a very cheap way of actually getting information about a whole population. So the fact that it became a lot cheaper also made actually GDP more easy to calculate. And I think we're now in a phase that we have loads of big data, and this new system should actually capitalize on big data. And that would also give us a way to leapfrog actually the GDP multinational, because big data is often very much in real time. It's far more granular, all this electronic data. So I actually think the big data revolution will actually give us an added impulse to actually make systems like this and actually leapfrog the GDP multinational in that sense.
Okay, thanks. Next question from Philip. So this one is very broad in terms of, or it is specific in terms of we're putting the human nature or the humankind at the core of all these approaches. Yeah. So is there any alternative that is also considering animals, plants, and nature or the environment as a whole?
Yes, I would say yes, but I do agree with him. I think a lot of, even the things I said were still very human-centric. I think that also has a little bit to do in selling it to people. There are methods, of course, within ecology, for example, that show the resilience of ecosystems or thresholds, for example. So there are methods, also thermodynamic methods of exergy, I think are very interesting to explore. And in my book, I'm also very critical of language such as natural capital or ecosystem services, because they kind of ingrain the narrative that nature is useful because it's a production factor which provides services to humanity. And so I also think that when we are creating these new narratives, we need to be very conscious of where economics and anthropocentric approaches are too dominant, I think, in our conversation. And the word natural capital, for example, I find, I guess it's useful in some domains, but I find it actually a wrong word to use, because it again kind of imposes an economic narrative on it. But so yes, there are methods that go beyond human and anthropocentric perspectives. But I do think there should be more developments there. The methods which I review in chapter 10 of my book, most of them are still anthropocentric.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see really quick. One more question about crises, governments and economists, in terms of economists giving advice to governments. Mm-hmm. So essentially, we're having a lot of skepticism against economists in Western European countries. Or yeah. I think what you mentioned earlier is also skepticism towards science in general. So how does this relate to the current crisis? And based on the past experience, what could be different this time? Or what is different after the financial crisis? Do we have some trust issue in terms of people not trusting scientists, maybe?
Well, I think virologists have a pretty high standing at the moment. More than economists, I would say. What I would say is that I think Danny Roderick's book on economic rules, I really like that book, because it also shows you that an economist doesn't really exist. There are so many schools and approaches to economics, And, you know, in some situation, one type of economics is good, and in other cases, another. But I think what happens is that economists, because they are so powerful, that's why we view them critically. I think all powerful institutes are viewed critically, and you know, people, I hear less criticism of sociologists, but I think that's also a reflection of the fact that sociologists probably have less, you know, less power. So you need to be critical of the powers that be. And I think we also need to realize that throughout history, different types of economics have been dominant. So, you know, the economics after the war was very much government-oriented, Keynesian, perhaps left-wing, you might say, policies. And then, of course, we got more of this neoliberal Friedman, Lucas type thinking, supply side thinking. So even just saying there is criticism of economists, I think probably now the criticism is towards the most dominant type of economics, which still I think is to a large extent neoclassical, neoliberal type economics. But I think that is quite quickly also shifting towards different perspectives. So whether I do think we will want the advice of economists, and in a crisis like this, I do think we will trust our economists if they do show that they have our interests in mind. And you know, we want to see, you know, in the US, when 33 million people become unemployed and many of them lose their healthcare because of that and their income, you know, whatever that economist says, it should be a policy that really shows that they know what huge impact this has on these people.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I would suggest we continue with one last question and afterwards move on to the quiz, because we're already a bit over time. I hope you don't mind. Thank you already. And the last question from the Q&A is on carbon pricing. So the Stiglitz-Stern report and also the COP21 highlighted it as the main instrument to fight climate change. What is your opinion on that one?
I think carbon prices should be implemented. So I am a proponent of carbon pricing, but I actually think that sometimes also that's kind of a welfare economics perspective. I see other hopeful things that are perhaps even more influential. I know, for example, that at the Central Bank of the Netherlands, they have a policy now that all the banks need to look at their carbon risks of their portfolios. And because of that, actually, there's a lot of divestment from banks in fossil fuel companies, in all types of things. And what that actually does is it actually increases the interest rates which you know, fossil fuel companies will have to pay. So the idea of carbon pricing is, of course, that increases the price of fossil fuels. But if they actually also increases because the interest rates which they have to pay are higher because nobody wants to lend them any money anymore, that is also another way in which I think a lot can be done. And I think actually investment millions, you know, the billions of investment, and especially in this post-COVID era, if you really look at that, all those billions of dollars, if that actually shifts from one area to the other, even by 10, 20%, you know, I think that has a huge influence. So I would not want to bet only on carbon pricing. I think to make a balanced setting, it's good to have carbon pricing, but I'm actually very interested in how the financial world and investment will actually impact fossil fuel investments in the future.
Very nice closing of the Q&A. So many thanks to you. Many thanks also to our audience for contributing that many questions that are definitely worth some more discussions at our next webinars and also for your personal work, I suppose, Rutger.
Thanks, yeah.
Anyway, I think this is a good conclusion for today. Maybe one more
Vincent,
time.
can I say one more thing?
Yeah, exactly.
I saw that there was a lot of questions which I couldn't answer.
Yeah.
If you could send me a note either through Twitter or through my email address, which was at the beginning, then I'll probably be able to answer them, because I'd love to answer any questions that people have.
Very nice offer. Thank you. So I will just forward those questions to you, and afterwards you can simply stay in touch and hopefully answer any open questions.
Yeah.
Also, right now you can see it in the chat function, like Rutger's email address. If you got any more questions, feel free to reach out to him.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And thank you, Joris, for your email. So I just leave the window open a few more seconds so that everyone can take down the email address. And afterwards, we are coming to the end of today's webinar. If you want to stay in touch, just use our platforms. That is Facebook or the website. And apart from that, I'd say see you soon. Bye-bye.